In the paper on fertility, let's focus in this module on Bongaarts' Promixate determinants model. In this module, the major learning objectives would be to understand Bongaarts' model, to understand variations in levels of each inhibiting factors of fertility in different settings, and to have a critique on the main limitations of the model. Studies of the causes of fertility levels and their changes often seeks to measure directly the impact of socioeconomic factors on fertility. Such procedures have a broad appeal to policymakers, offering as they do to pinpoint mechanisms which are susceptible to manipulation by official policy makers. Despite this appeal, such approaches are considerably more problematical in their application. Not infrequently, relationships are found to differ not only in magnitude but even in direction in different settings and at different times, as mentioned by Cochrane, 1979. Substantial insights can be gained if, in addition to the socioeconomic factors influencing fertility, the specific mechanisms through which these factors operate are identified and also understood. For example, the level of education of women is a socioeconomic indicator that is frequently found to be negatively related to fertility. A more detailed analysis may show that among educated women, marriage is relatively late or use of contraception more frequent, thus clarifying the relationship between education and fertility. In general, the biological and behavioral factors through which socioeconomic, cultural and environmental variables affect fertility are called intermediate fertility variables, as per Bongaarts, 1978. The primary characteristics of intermediate fertility variables is its direct influence on fertility levels. If intermediate fertility variables such as the prevalence of contraception changes, then fertility necessarily changes also, assuming the other intermediate fertility variables remains constant, while this is not necessarily the case for an indirect determinants such as income or education. Consequently, fertility differences among populations and trends in fertility over time can always be traced to variations in one or more of the intermediate fertility variables, according to Bongaarts, 1978. Although these relationships have been recognized since the pioneering work of Kingsley Davis and Judith Blake in 1956, in the mid-50s, the efforts to quantify the link between a set of intermediate fertility variables and fertility levels have proven difficult and have thus far only resulted in highly complex reproductive models. The concepts of proximate determinants, let's focus here. Human fertility is governed by a number of immediate biological and behavioral factors which are themselves influenced by distal, socioeconomic and cultural factors. In order to understand the cause of variations and changes in fertility levels between populations and over time, it is necessary to understand the mechanisms through which various factors influence fertility. The proximate determinants of fertility are the biological and behavioral factors through which social, economic, cultural and environmental variables influence fertility. They have direct effects on fertility. Contraceptive use and sexual activity may be the most obvious factors affecting the level of fertility in different populations. The Bongaarts model is a tool for examining the relative contribution of each of the four factors to the inhibition of fertility from its theoretical maximum. It's an aggregate fertility model which describes the relationship between fertility and the four principal proximate determinants, that is marriage, contraception, induced abortion and postpartum infectability or postpartum insusceptibility. The four proximate determinants are considered as inhibitors of fertility because their action means that fertility is lower than its theoretical maximum. Fertility is lower than its maximum because of factors like delayed marriage and marital disruptions, the use of contraceptives, induced abortions and postpartum infectability due to breastfeeding and postpartum abstinence. The relation of total fertility rate and the inhibitors of fertility are expressed in the following equation. Total fertility rate is equal to TF multiplied by CM and CI multiplied with CA and again multiplied with CC, where TFR is equal to total fertility rate, TF is equal to total fecundity rate, CM is equal to index of marriage, CI is equal to index of postpartum infectability, CA is equal to index of abortion, CC is equal to index of contraception. Let's discuss about the other issue related to index of marriage, that is marriage which is through exposure to sexual intercourse. The index of marriage, which is denoted as CM, is intended to express the reduction in fertility caused by women not being sexually active throughout their entire reproductive period. The index is often approximated by the proportion of women in the reproductive age of 15 to 49 who are married. The formula refers to is CM is equal to sigma of MA multiplied by GA whole divided by sigma GA, where MA refers to age specific proportions of currently married or in sexual union women, GA refers to age specific marital fertility rates, usually referred as ASMFRs. To estimate CM, we take a weighted average of the age specific proportions of currently married women with the weights provided by age specific marital fertility rates. Strictly speaking, we cannot simply take the proportions of all women who are married, since the fertility impact of marriage varies depending on the age distribution of married women. Married women in the central childbearing years contributes more to the total fertility rate than the younger, that is below 20 years, or older women, that is above 40 plus years do. An alternative approach is take the ratio of fertility of all women to the fertility of those married, which is usually defined and presented as CM is equal to TFR by TMFR, where TFR is equal to total fertility rate, TMFR is the total marital fertility rate. The other aspect which is to be discussed here is postpartum infectability or postpartum insusceptibility. It is referred to through an index of postpartum infectability, usually measured as CI. The index of postpartum infectability is intended to measure the effects on fertility of extended periods of postpartum infectability, are often called postpartum insusceptibility due to postpartum amenorrhea and postpartum abstinence, as per Bongaarts 1982. The index is calculated as CI is equal to 20 by 18 plus 18.5 plus I, where I is equal to average duration of postpartum infectability, that is postpartum insusceptibility, caused by breastfeeding and postpartum abstinence. If no breastfeeding or postpartum abstinence is practiced, the birth interval averages about 20 months. This is made up of 1.5 months minimum postpartum infectable period, 7.5 months of waiting time to conception on an average, 2 months of time added by spontaneous intrauterine mortality on an average, 9 months for a full-time pregnancy. Therefore, in the presence of breastfeeding and postpartum abstinence, the average birth interval equals approximately 18.5 months, that is 7.5 plus 2 plus 9 plus the duration of postpartum infectability, which is defined by length of postpartum amenorrhea and abstinence. This factor therefore measures the fertility inhibiting effects by taking the ratio of the minimum birth interval, that is 20 months, and that extended by postpartum amenorrhea or abstinence. Let's discuss about the contraception. The index is intended to measure the fertility inhibiting effects of contraceptive use. The index is calculated as follows. Cc is equal to 1 minus 1.08 multiplied by small u multiplied by small e, where u refers to prevalence of current contraceptive use among married women of reproductive age, e refers to average use effectiveness of contraception. Here, the index of contraception varies inversely with the prevalence and use effectiveness of contraception. If contraceptive practice is absent or completely inefficient, Cc becomes 1.0. The factor 1.08 represents an adjustment for the fact that couples do not use contraception if they know or believe that they are infecund. The absence of contraception among such infecund couples implies that the contraception that is practiced is concentrated among fertile couples. Therefore, U, which measures prevalence among all couples, has to be inflated to take into account of this concentration of contraception. Use effectiveness of contraception is another issue that requires focus, and contraception does not protect women from pregnancy unless couples use the method which they have chosen effectively and consistently. While it is difficult to measure the use effectiveness of contraception, let's focus about contraceptive prevalence. Contraceptive prevalence varies across populations. Over 70% of women use modern contraceptive methods in many parts of the world, like in North America, Europe, Brazil, China, Australia, and other regions. On the other hand, low prevalence, that is less than 20% of contraceptive usage, is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, where the total fertility rates are high, that is over 4 children per woman. The other aspect that requires attention in this regard is on abortions. The index of abortion, which is intended to measure the inhibiting effects of induced abortion. The equation for the index is calculated by recognizing that each abortion will avert somewhat less than one birth because A spontaneous abortion or stillbirth may have prevented the pregnancy from ending in a live birth, and B, following an induced abortion, a woman resumes ovulation much sooner than would have been the case had she carried the pregnancy to term, meaning that subsequent pregnancy is likely to follow sooner. The formula here refers to Ca is equal to total fertility rate divided by total fertility rate plus 0.4 multiplied by 1 plus U multiplied by Ta, where Ta is referring to total abortion rate. total number of abortions over the reproductive period per woman among only married women. U refers to contraceptive prevalence. Abortion rate. Abortion is one of the most difficult health outcomes to quantify. More data and estimation methods have been improved, however, in recent years. What are the major problems and limitations in adopting this method requires our attention. The Bongaarts proximate determinants framework is theoretically strong, however, there are several limitations. Let's discuss all this here. While Bongaarts framework on proximate determinants of fertility elucidates the relationship between levels of fertility and biological and behavioral factors, it's of course a simplification of reality. As mentioned earlier, it is not intended to obtain an accurate estimate of total fertility rate. Rather, it is intended to aid the analysis and explanation of fertility differentials. By focusing interest on the links between each of the proximate fertility variables and various socioeconomic and cultural background factors, several studies have attempted to apply the model using individual data, but it is often reported that the model does not explain all the variations in levels of fertility due to some of the above reasons or due to the model itself. However, Buscheri and Hinde in 2007 recently applied the model to explain the variations in birth intervals between the first and second children using individuals' contraceptive calendar data from an Egyptian demographic and health survey of DHS. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the framework was developed in the 1970s when individual demographic data were scarce and some of the data, such as the data on abortion, effectiveness of contraceptive use, and sexual activities, are hard to obtain accurately. Thus, a number of additional factors or complications are worth highlighting and may warrant consideration in certain circumstances. What it implies is that this quantitative framework adopted and suggested by Bongaarts allows the dissection of a fertility level into its approximate determining components that are labeled under the intermediate fertility variables. The analysis indicates that variations in 4 factors, that is, marriage, contraception, lactation, and induced abortion, they are the primary proximate causes of fertility differences among various populations in the world. The model can be used in comparative fertility analysis mainly to determine the intermediate fertility variables which are responsible for fertility differences among populations or among subgroups within a population. This application can be valuable in analysis of the socioeconomic determinants of fertility because the intermediate fertility variables allow the identification of the paths through which different socioeconomic variables affects fertility. This module has introduced the concept of proximate determinants of fertility as biological and behavioral factors which are themselves influenced by distal, socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental factors. It explains the Bongaarts aggregate proximate determinants model mainly to understand the fertility differentials across populations and over time by focusing interest on the links between each of the proximate fertility variables. Based on the model, levels of fertility is determined by the important components like marriage or sexual union, that's proxy of exposure to sexual intercourse. The other aspect is about postpartum infectability, the contraceptive prevalences and their use effectiveness, and abortions. Other factors such as pathological sterility are also important in some populations. The Bongaarts model has been improved by Stover, especially by the use of sexual activity instead of marriage, making it more applicable in many countries, especially outside of Asia. Stover's model also takes proper account of sterility, which is an important and changing factor in many developing countries. However, when it is to be seen that Bongaarts' model is widely used given its merits as referred above. Regardless of the limitations, the model adopted and brought out by Bongaarts is conceptually useful in the study of fertility and practically useful too. It allows the modeling of what-if situations, such as what-if situations, what would happen to fertility, especially total fertility rate, if contraceptive prevalence increased to X%. It allows fertility comparisons of various countries where fertility is changing in different degrees, in different combinations of factors, though the difficulty of getting reliable data on factors like abortion, sexual activities, and consistent contraceptive use and its effectiveness is to a great extent is a weakness in this model. The model is useful to assess variations in fertility. An analysis of various determinants of fertility that includes the intermediate fertility variables can therefore greatly clarify the relationships that exist between various socioeconomic indicators and fertility levels. The model can also be used to trace a change in the fertility level of a population to changes in the intermediate fertility variables. And also, we need to understand that in projections of future fertility trends, this model brought out by Bongaarts can be widely used to estimate how much one or a combination of several of the intermediate fertility variables would have to be modified to obtain a given reduction in fertility. This projection of alternative paths towards a future fertility decline could be of interest to planners and policy makers. Overall, we may conclude that the model brought out by Bongaarts have a great help in the analysis of fertility and giving a final very scientific interpretation for proximate determinants of fertility as postulated by Bongaarts, where it elicits clearly the relationship that exists between levels of fertility and biological and behavioral factors is a very, very important contribution in the field of fertility. It is very important for us to know that the various proximate determinants of important components which have been specifically brought out by Bongaarts by focusing on vital events like marriage or sexual union, the postpartum infectability, the contraceptive prevalences and its use effectiveness, and the other dimension of important aspect of abortion. These factors are very, very vital, and this how they act as proximate determinants is a very important way of understanding in the fertility analysis. The other aspect is about by applying these determinants, one could understand the differences and differentials that exist across different populations over a period of time, so that a scientific attempt can be made mainly to understand not only the levels of fertility and its variations, but also to know the various factors in areas of social, economical, demographical, health, cultural and other such factors, how they are relatively and cumulatively influencing the fertility levels in a given community over a period of time is of scientific importance and also a major contribution in the area of fertility. In that way, Bongaarts model is widely referred, and the Bongaarts list of variables are of great importance in the area of fertility. One would easily understand that the factors and the relative contributions of the listed components which are labeled as proximate determinants by Bongaart are of widely referred in various communities, and also these factors are of great essence in understanding not only the levels of fertility but also the type and the extent of interventions that the health planners and the demographers are bringing out at the ground level, so as to see that the changes in the fertility takes place and its levels are to a minimum level where it has an implication for the overall development. To that extent, it is important to understand the Bongaarts model of proximate determinants of fertility.